Janet Yellen, suggesting we're closer to a Fed move. The data suggesting they may not be. Larry Summers is opining on that in the Washington Post, the former U.S. Treasury Secretary, with my morning must-read this morning, questioning whether the Fed has a credibility problem, particularly if they try to deal with a new downturn in the U.S. economy, and the data suggests that's a possibility. He says, I wonder what credibility Fed forward guidance is likely to have given the utter disconnect over many years between Fed and market views regarding future rates and the track record so far of the Fed being wrong and the market being right. We are joined now by Michelle Meyer. She's Bank of America Merrill Lynch's head of U.S. economics, and still with us, Megan Green, Manulife Asset Management chief economist. We've got a summit of chiefs here. Let me ask you both, and I'll start with you, Michelle. Does the Fed have a credibility problem? We've had Janet Yellen suggest a rate rise is closer. Stanley Fischer saying we might get two, which would mean they would probably have to do one in September. And yet the market and the data suggesting this is not going to happen.
I think that, I don't know if I would say outright it's a credibility problem, but I think it's certainly a communication challenge. Part of that is because just like market participants, just like forecasters, they're responding to the flow of the data. So they have their set of forecasts, which I would say is within the SAP is probably their best case scenario. And then as the data comes in, they have to tweak their assumptions as they look at the evolution of financial conditions, as they look at the different risks globally. They change their trajectory for the dots and for interest rate projections. So I think that part of the issue is their communication. They have the dots, which are really the best case scenario. They're not showing the risk profile around that, which I think is skewed to the downside, closer to what the market is saying.
Well, the Summers article is basically focused on the idea that he believes we're going to see a recession in the next couple of years, and the Fed cannot address that. What do they do? Because Janet Yellen says, according to this new paper by David Reichneider at the Fed, that they'll have interest rates at 3%, and that'll be enough to cut. Summers says we might not be at 1% by the time we get to recession.
Yeah, and I think Summers raises an important point, which is that, if the Fed risks by going too quickly, then they might have an ammunition problem in the future. So it's much more prudent for the Fed to go slow, have a shallow cycle, and try to extend the business cycle that ultimately you can have interest rates a little bit higher where you have a bit more ammunition for the next cycle. So it means that you do want to overshoot your inflation target a little bit. It means that you want to allow the economy to overheat to the extent that that's possible, and you don't want to rush with interest rate hikes. So I think for folks maybe like Fisher, where they're really looking at their progress towards the dual mandate, they're at full employment, inflation is starting to pick up, the policy prescription there is to hike. But if you take into account all of the risks associated with this cycle and potentially difficulties at the zero bound going forward, then you want to take a much slower approach.
Michelle, the problem is that if you don't, so the counter-argument to that is that if you don't normalize soon when you see a potential window, is that something happens with China, something happens in the world economy that means that they have to delay yet again hiking, which means that we're in fictitious markets where we could also possibly see defaults being, pushed back because of these low rates.
Yeah, I think that that's the balance, is that if the Fed has the objective and the intention to normalize and to hike, then it means that they need to get started, and that's what they've told us. But at the same time, you don't want to make a mistake where you go too quickly and then you end up derailing the recovery. So if you're going to make a mistake, it seems like it's better to go slowly, maybe allow for some overheating to occur, maybe allow for some inflation to pick up even outside of asset price inflation, real inflation in the economy. So you're right, yes, there is the risk of just time. Things happen, and you could have another shock. And obviously, if the Fed hasn't normalized, then they're kind of stuck with a very low environment of rates when that shock happens. But I think the idea is that there's even a more risky scenario, which is that they hike too quickly and then they end up destabilizing the economy and the markets.